Callatis Chronicles by Song W. Eretson. Chapter 1. The Black Rose. Ducking into the alley had been a mistake, Heather realized. She had hoped to lose the guards, but had been too slow, and now she was fully exposed. 4 days before the summer solstice, Callatis bustled with preparations for the upcoming celebrations. Banners emblazoned with Aurora's sun sigil had begun to appear throughout the city, while flower pots around the city had been replanted with new, colorful blooms. The sweet scent mixed with rosemary, basil, garlic, cloves, and roasting meat in the market. It all created a heady cacophony, which she had been in the midst of just a few minutes before. Merchants haggled and hawked their wares, while customers purchased supplies and placed orders ahead of the festival. Commoners and nobles intermingled, shopped and gossiped. A few people schemed in the shadows, if not right in broad daylight. A cool breeze blew off the sea, past the merchant and pleasure vessels moored in the harbor, warding off some of the early summer heat so the crowds weren't too uncomfortable. Heather had decided to take the day for herself, no pickpocketing or canvassing. She had planned to enjoy the preparations. Instead, she had 5 guards hot on her heels as she ran down an empty alleyway. Not for the first time, she cursed Caspian as she ran. Up ahead of her, she saw an open door into one of the shops on the main avenue. A couple was pressed against the wall, tangled in a deep kiss that blinded them to the world. They jolted apart in surprise when Heather jumped onto the steps beside them. Before they could react, she ran inside and closed the door behind her with a resounding slam. It would buy her mere seconds, but those seconds were precious. She found herself in an unlit storage room, but didn't slow down. Just enough light came through a half-open door to see the wooden shelves against the wall and the crates and barrels stacked on the floor. In the doorway, she nearly ran into a young woman who cried out in surprise. Heather felt a twinge of guilt, but dodged around her and kept running. She burst into the front of the shop, surprising a merchant and the 4 or 5 customers gathered there. A marble counter blocked her way to the door. An oil and vinegar shop, she realized, finally noticing the strong, tangy smell that permeated the air. Behind her, Heather heard the guards force the door open. Their steps were heavy as they stormed into the shop. Thinking fast, she vaulted over the counter. Ignoring the startled customers, she ran straight for the door. Once out in the street, she was frustrated to find herself no longer in the heart of the market. Instead, she had moved north into the more affluent, less crowded area of town. To her left, a block and a half down, she could see the memorial fountain and the market beyond that. Behind her came the sound of the guards reaching the door, pressing her to keep moving. She veered right. The merchant with the heavy crate suddenly turned into her path, and she barely dodged to avoid him. He cried out in surprise, then shouted at her to watch where she was going. The guard calling for someone to grab her was a far more pressing issue. She ignored the burning in her lungs and pushed herself to run faster. Without a crowd, the scattered people around her became more of a threat than a protection. Reaching the next corner, she turned left, relieved to see that no one was there. One of the shops caught her attention. Above the door, a carved wooden sign hung from the wrought iron bar. Intricate knotwork, reminiscent of the northern lands, framed the words, Thorensen Curiosities and Consultations, painted in black and violet. The name set off the bell in the back of her head, though she was sure that she'd never seen the shop before. And she didn't have time to consider why. With a shaky breath, she decided to take her chance inside. As soon as she stepped inside the cool air of the shop, Heather found herself face to face with a wolf, her breath caught with a whimper, heart pounding in her ears as she looked into the tense blue eyes of a large gray wolf on the wall. She blinked as her thoughts realigned, and she came back to her senses. The wolf wasn't real. It was only a beautifully painted mural on the top half of the far wall. Above, dark wood waistcoating. A scene of what she thought might be the northern forest with a pack of wolves among the trees and ferns. Heather gave a small sob of relief as she collected herself, then took a deep breath and looked around. The shop front was small, about 10 feet across and 16 feet wide. To her right, a bookshelf was built into the wall, filled with books and knickknacks. To her left were 2 wing-back chairs, an end table between them. There didn't appear to be any wares for sale. In front of the mural was a polished dark wood counter carved with knotwork with a polished marble surface. The rest of the space was similar dark wood, and the scent in the air was paper and wood polish, a delightfully simple smell after the market and the oil shop. "Search the shops! She's here somewhere!" The cry was accompanied by a clatter of armor and boots on the cobblestone streets outside. Heather's eyes darted around, searching for the best place to hide. But with such sparse decor, there were few options. There was the counter and the door next to the mural that she only noticed on a second look, but the door had no knob. She knew better than to try opening locked doors without knobs. Instead, she ducked behind the counter. The back was as much of a work of art as the front. The drawers and the cupboard were beautifully carved, but neither had a knob or handle. Panic surged through her. If the guards searched thoroughly, hiding behind the counter wouldn't save her. As aggressively as they had pursued her, she had no doubt that they would be thorough. Gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles turned white, Heather sobbed as she rested her forehead against the cupboard door. Tears welled in her eyes, spilled down her cheeks. How had it come to this? Once more, she cursed Caspian, the egotistic, self-righteous bastard. All of this was his fault. Just as she began to sink into self-pity, she heard footsteps. But it wasn't the clatter of guards in armor, and it wasn't coming from the door. Looking to her left, she blinked in surprise at the arched doorway and the staircase that she could have sworn hadn't been there before. A man's charcoal leather boots appeared in the chair. Very nice leather boots, according to her trained eye. As he continued down the stairs, she saw dark pants and a blue jerkin. Even in her current situation, her heart fluttered when she saw his face. He was in his early 20s, handsome in an unassuming way that she found incredibly charming. His chestnut hair was lightly tousled, but not messy, and his blue eyes reminded her of the wolf on the mural behind her, shrewd and intelligent. He looked her over, expression carefully schooled. There was no sign of surprise as he looked at her, but she did see his expression flicker. "Please," she said, throwing herself at the man's mercy. "Hide me." He looked toward the front door of the shop, where they could hear the guards on the street. There were far more than the original 5 now. "I'll expect an explanation," he said. "I'll give you one," she promised. "Just don't let them find me." He nodded, coming down to the last few steps and behind the counter. Heather flinched as he came closer, but he walked past her, opening the drawer to the counter and withdrawing a large book. She looked up at him in confusion. "Stay here," he murmured, and rested his hand on her head. At first, she was offended at the touch, which seemed condescending, but he murmured something under his breath, and she felt a tingling sensation down her spine. Magic. That sent a different kind of chill down her neck. She tried to look at him without being too obvious. Her eyes fell on the boot next to her. Just as she had thought, the leather and workmanship were the highest quality. A bulge in the side caught her attention. A knife, she realized. Another one hung up from his belt, unobtrusive but easily accessible if needed. Her memory finally found what it had been nagging at her since she'd first read the sign on the door. Thorenson. Her heart stuttered in her chest. The Thorensons were a family from the north, as the decor suggested. Their history stretched back to the Aurelian Empire, if the stories that she had heard were true, stories of merciless battles, rivals who disappeared, and women who fell under their savage spell. They were one of the most powerful families in the Republic, with connections to the ruling families, important enough that she had heard the name repeatedly over the past few years, even when she didn't bother paying attention to politics. Heather shuddered, wondering if she hadn't entered an even more dangerous situation. Hammond was in his study when he heard the commotion in the street. He had left his windows open to let in the sea breeze and the sound of life from people going up and down Laurel Avenue, sounds that were suddenly overtaken by loud clatters and calls. He looked up from the grimoire that he was studying and listened as they approached his shop. Standing up, he went to the window and looked down the street. But before he got there, something else drew his attention. The security spells that he had carefully laid downstairs alerted him that someone had entered the shop. His head turned away from the window, and he looked toward the staircase. He didn't have any appointments that afternoon, and midday wasn't usually the time for people to drop by unannounced. Even the market would be closing down while people went to lunch and waited for the heat of the day to pass. "Search the shops," someone called from the streets. "She's here somewhere." With a frown, Hammond turned to an oval mirror that hung on the wall to his left. A gesture caused the glass to cloud over for a moment before giving him a view into the shop. A dark-haired woman stood inside the doorway, looking around frantically for a place to hide. He looked down at the street again and saw the city guards gathering. They had begun to search the shops among the street, pushing open doors and pounding on those that were locked. There were already 10 of them, with another group arriving. All of which seemed rather excessive for one young woman, he thought. Turning away from the window and the mirror, he went downstairs. As he reached the first landing, another spell went off, alerting him of the intruder that was trying to open the cupboard and the counter. The doorway at the bottom of the stairs appeared as he neared it. The woman looked over as he approached, her eyes wide, and Hammond found himself momentarily distracted. Her black hair was pulled up in a braid crown, but some had come free, framing bright, cat-like green eyes that glistened with desperate tears. Full pink lips quivered as she looked at him. She was beautiful and desperate, his two weaknesses. "Don't look anyone in the eye," he said, lifting his hand from her head. He withdrew a glass quill and inkwell from a drawer and began to review the notes in the ledger. "The spell can't hold up to eye contact." Simple spells always had limitations. As a spellcaster, however, he could still see her as she hugged her knees to her chest, back pressed against the cupboard door. He felt a pang of sympathy, but wasn't sure how to assure her. Before he could think what he was saying, he realized that the guards had gone quiet. He could still hear them searching the other shops on the street, but something had changed. Finally, the door to his shop opened, but it wasn't with the force of the city guards storming in to raid the shop. Instead, it was opened aggressively by a single man who stalked inside with irritating arrogance. Hammond pretended to look up from the ledger carefully to hide his annoyance. "Caspian," he said, "to what do I owe the visit?" Hammond felt his teeth set on edge as Caspian Graves entered the shop. The captain of the guard was around Hammond's height, with olive-toned skin, brown eyes, black hair that he wore slicked back. He wore a black cape over his armor to ensure that no one would forget his position. A position Hammond still wished someone else had gotten. In the several years Hammond had known Caspian, he had concluded that the man was full of himself to an absurd degree. He was so focused on his aims and perceived success that he refused to see his own failings. He had been the prefect's council's chancellor when the position for captain of the guard had opened, but despite his allies' best efforts, Caspian won the position, and never let anyone forget it. Hammond sometimes wondered if it was the greatest failure of his career. Caspian's upper lip curled slightly as he looked around the shop. "I'm looking for a criminal." "That sounds serious," Hammond said, feigning interest. "A thief," Caspian elaborated. Hammond resisted the urge to mirror his disgusted look, but for the very different reason. "Did you want me to see if I can locate her?" "My men told me that she came down this street," Caspian said. "So she may just have come into one of these shops to hide." "No one came in here," Hammond said. Caspian gave a dismissive hum, stalking around the room like an animal in a cage. His dark eyes swept the room before he came to look behind the counter. Hammond didn't dare look at the woman next to him, but he quietly willed her to remember what he had said about not making eye contact. He did look over when Caspian reached for the cupboard door. Sure enough, she moved like a thief, slipping out of the way to the other side of Hammond's feet. "The cupboard is sealed," Hammond said. "Only I can open it." That wasn't quite true. A handful of people did access it, but he felt no need to explain that to Caspian. Still, to appease the man, Hammond opened the cupboard. Even if it weren't sealed, there wasn't enough space for her to hide. There was a shelf in the middle, filled with ink bottles, paper, and sundry station supplies. Caspian gave the interior an annoying look before slamming the cupboard closed. Hammond couldn't stop himself from glaring, but fortunately, Caspian had already turned his attention to the door next to the mural. "I wouldn't touch—" He was too late. Caspian had already pushed the door with the gloved hand, only to gasp as he was shocked by the warding spell. "That's sealed as well," Hammond sighed, unable to keep the annoyance out of his voice. "And protected." "So I see," Caspian said through gritted teeth. "I could almost be suspicious of how tightly you keep this place locked up, Hammond." "You know the people I work for," Hammond reminded, hoping that the man would also remember his place. I'm hardly going to leave their papers lying around unsecured. Caspian might be a captain of the guard from a moderately respected military family, but Hammond was a Thorinson, with connections to a ruling family. You're sure that no one could get in there? Caspian asked, still rubbing his shocked palm. You tell me, Hammond said with a pointed look. But he reminded himself that he should maintain a polite facade. Antagonizing the man wouldn't get this over any faster. Instead, he reached for the door. The wrought iron knob appeared under his fingers and turned easily. I assure you, whoever you're looking for couldn't get in. Caspian still stepped inside, looking around. While Hammond had the chairs in the front room, he conducted appointments in the back room. It was more than twice the size of the front room, set up as a parlor. Bookshelves lined the walls, while couches and armchairs created comfortable sitting area with a locked desk against the wall. But as Caspian looked around, the only thing that seemed to interest him was the wooden glass liquor cabinet. Who are you looking for? Hammond asked, wanting to keep Caspian focused. The sooner he could be convinced that there was nothing there, the sooner he would leave, but Caspian's face darkened as he looked around again, more than Hammond had anticipated. The Black Rose. Hammond barely stopped himself from looking over at the woman. The Black Rose was one of the best thieves in the city, having worked her way up the ranks of the Thieves' Guild in the few short years, and while she was rumored to be beautiful, Hammond hadn't put much stock in that idea. People tended to romanticize what fascinated them, and rumors of the Black Rose certainly fascinated people. And in this case, they hadn't done her justice. She was spotted in the market, Caspian went on. I wasn't aware anyone knew what she looked like, Hammond said. He might have been wrong, but he could have sworn Caspian's face turned red. The reaction only piqued Hammond's interest more. But he already had the promise of explanation from the Black Rose herself. He had no need to get it from Caspian, and no interest in having the man in his shop longer than necessary. Finally, satisfied that the parlor was empty, Caspian returned to the front room with an irritated look. Hammond closed the door, the knob disappearing again as soon as he let go, and looked around the room. It took a moment to find her, crouched in the corner behind one of the chairs at the table, out of the way, but still able to watch and listen. As Caspian looked around, she hid her face behind a chair, avoiding accidental eye contact. Caspian gave an annoyed huff, glowering at nothing particular. Insolent hussy, he muttered. She probably went into one of the other shops, Hammond said. There aren't many places to hide in here. That earned a glare from Caspian, who didn't like being spoken down to. The man seemed constantly looking to take offense at anything said to him. Probably, he said with a scowl. I blame my men for being inept. It shouldn't be so hard to catch one girl. A will to live is a powerful thing. Hammond ran a hand over his ledger, trying to get across the hint that the shop was empty and he wanted to get back to work. What's that supposed to mean? Caspian asked, face twisted in a scowl. I just mean to say that if she doesn't want to be caught, she'll fight to avoid it, Hammond said. It's impressive how far some people will go to stay alive. Not that Caspian seemed at all impressed. With a final glance around the shop, as if to convince himself that he'd missed something, Caspian turned back to the door. If you see her, let me know. Of course, Hammond said, without meaning it in the slightest. He had no intention of telling Caspian anything. The captain of the guard nodded, then finally left. When the door closed behind him, Hammond took a moment to breathe deeply and calm his agitation. This was far more excitement than he had expected from today. Once he regained composure, he glanced over at the woman. She looked at him with wide, beautiful green eyes as she stood up in the corner. I think it's time for that explanation,